My sister used to laugh at me for marrying a farmer. My parents even agreed with her, saying I could have done better. But when their so-called perfect lives came crashing down, they found themselves begging the very man they had mocked. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. It's strange how one sentence can cut deeper than years of silence. I can still hear my sister's voice in my head, sharp and dismissive. Well, at least I didn't marry a farmer. The words were thrown out casually, like she was tossing away a scrap of paper. But for me, they landed with the weight of a stone, lodging somewhere between my chest and throat. I remember sitting at that table, my fork halfway to my mouth, my cheeks flushing hot. The laugh that followed hers first, then my parents chiming in made my stomach twist. They thought it was funny, just a joke. But jokes often hide the ugliest truths about how people really see you. And in that moment, it was clear as day. My sister and my parents saw my husband as nothing more than dirt under their shoes. My husband, bless him, just kept eating. He didn't respond, didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. That was his way, quiet, steady, a man who believed dignity was stronger than any insult. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the brief shadow across his face before he pushed it down. I knew it hurt him, even if he'd never admit it. And it hurt me more than I can explain. Because to me, he wasn't just anything. He was the man who woke before dawn to tend to his fields, who worked with his hands until they were calloused and strong, who carried a kind of grounded wisdom city people often mistake for simplicity. To me, he was everything. But in that moment, round that table, surrounded by the laughter of my own family, I realized something. This wasn't harmless teasing. This was a line being drawn, a divide between us. They had decided he wasn't worthy of respect, and by extension, neither was I. That dinner would become the spark that lit the fuse of everything that followed. A fuse that would burn long and bright, until the day my sister and my parents finally understood the true weight of those words. Because sometimes life has a way of serving justice so perfectly, you couldn't script it better yourself. After that dinner, I found myself replaying old memories in my head, piecing together things I had brushed aside before. The truth is, my family had been planting little seeds of disrespect for years, and I had ignored them, hoping they'd wither away. But looking back now, the pattern was clear. Let me start with my husband. To me, he has always been the anchor in my life. He's the kind of man who doesn't need to prove himself with loud words or fancy titles. Every morning before the sun even stretched across the sky, he'd be out in the fields, tending to crops, checking irrigation lines, and making sure every corner of the land was thriving. His work ethic was unmatched, honest, relentless, and steady. He's not the type to boast, but I knew what many didn't. He had built something remarkable. Over the years, he had expanded his small plot into several acres, securing long-term contracts with major grocery chains. Our farm wasn't some fragile, hand-to-mouth operation. It was a business, one that provided jobs for others and gave us stability most families would envy. But because he wore boots instead of polished shoes, because he smelled of earth instead of cologne, people dismissed him, and unfortunately, my sister was the loudest voice in that chorus. She was always the glamorous one, the kind of woman who strutted into a room with designer bags swinging from her arm and a news story about her incredible lifestyle. Her husband worked in a corporate office downtown, and she paraded that like a medal she'd won. They vacationed twice a year in Europe, posted glossy pictures online, and filled their weekends with dinners at the most expensive restaurants. To her, appearances were everything, and in her eyes, my husband didn't fit that image of success. She called him simple. She called me traditional. But beneath those words was the sting of something else. She thought we were beneath her. My parents, sadly, often echoed her opinions. They were old-fashioned in the worst way, status-driven, obsessed with titles and salaries. If you wore a suit, they respected you. If you had dirt under your fingernails, they pitied you. My sister was their golden child, their pride. They boasted about her husband's big job, about their fancy new house, about the comfortable life she led. And me? I was the daughter who, in their eyes, settled day. It wasn't always this obvious. When I first introduced them to my husband, there were polite smiles, careful words, but little cracks showed even then. I remember my mother once asking if he planned to move on to something bigger, as if farming were just a temporary stop. My father asked, half joking, if I worried about working myself to death in the fields. At the time, I laughed it off, but now I can see those were the warning signs. In truth, our life was far from the picture they painted in their minds. Yes, we lived modestly. Our home was warm and practical rather than luxurious. And we didn't flash money around, but we had security, savings, and a quiet kind of joy that came from building something real together. Our life was rooted, stable, and fulfilling. And yet, round my family, none of that seemed to matter. They couldn't see past the word farmer. To them, it meant less than. And every visit, every gathering, carried little reminders of how differently they measured worth. Still, I told myself I could endure it. I loved my husband, and his opinion of me was the only one that truly mattered. I thought I could swallow their subtle digs, their sideways glances, but I didn't realize that sooner or later, the quiet disrespect would turn into something I could no longer ignore, because families like mine, they don't just stop at whispers. Eventually, they cross lines. And when they did, they went too far. The night everything truly shifted is still etched in my memory like it happened yesterday. It was supposed to be just another family dinner, one of those gatherings my parents insisted on to keep us all close. My sister had chosen the restaurant, of course. Somewhere trendy, with modern decor, overpriced meals, and servers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. My husband and I arrived early. He wore his cleanest button-up shirt, the one I had ironed that afternoon, and I could tell he had made an extra effort to look presentable. He always did when it came to my family, even though they never acknowledged it. We sat quietly at the table, waiting until the rest of them swept in. My sister was all shine and sparkle that night, draped in a dress that probably cost more than a month's groceries. Her husband with a watch so big it looked like it was trying to announce his presence. Before he even spoke, my parents followed, smiling proudly as if escorting royalty. The evening began as usual, small talk about traffic, about the latest shows they were watching, about how stressful her husband's big projects had become. I listened, nodding where appropriate, while my own husband sat silently, polite but never trying to one-up anyone. That was his nature. And then, just as the main course arrived, my sister leaned back in her chair, wine glass in hand, and smirked. "Well," she said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "at least I didn't marry a farmer." The words hit me like a slap across the face. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. But no, her tone was dripping with mockery. Her lips curled in satisfaction. My parents chuckled softly, as though she had delivered a clever punchline. My father even added, "Yes, dear, You really did choose well," nodding approvingly at her husband. I sat frozen, my fork hovering over my plate. Heat rushed to my face, and my heart thudded in my chest. My husband, steady as always, lowered his gaze and calmly continued cutting his food. He didn't say a word, but I saw it. The flicker in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened for just a second before he smoothed it over. He was used to enduring, but I could tell it stung inside, though I was seething. Their laughter echoed in my head, cruel and dismissive. This wasn't just another snide comment. This wasn't subtle. This was outright disrespect, laid bare in front of everyone. My sister had crossed the line, and my parents had joined her. I pressed my lips together, willing myself to stay calm. I wanted to scream, to call her out right there in the middle of the restaurant. But I didn't. Instead, I swallowed my anger and stayed quiet, because I knew something had shifted. Something inside me hardened in that moment. As we left that night, walking out into the cool evening air, I slipped my hand into my husband's. He gave me a small smile, as if to say, "Don't let it bother you." But I couldn't let it go. I promised myself then that I wouldn't keep tolerating this. One day, they would see. One day, the truth about who my husband really was and who they really were would come to light. That dinner wasn't just uncomfortable. It was the moment I realized my family had no intention of ever respecting him, and that realization would set everything else in motion. After that dinner, I thought maybe my sister had just gone too far after a glass of wine, that perhaps the comment would fade into the background like a bad memory. But I was wrong. Far from pulling back, she leaned into it, as if she had discovered her new favorite weapon. From then on, Farmer became her punchline. At every gathering, she found some way to slip it in. If my husband mentioned anything, whether it was about the weather or even a book he'd read, she'd grin and say something like, "Well, you would know. You spend all day outside like a farmer." My parents would chuckle softly, as though humoring a clever child. It wasn't just the words, though it was the tone, the way she dripped condescension over everything she said, the way she rolled her eyes if I tried to defend him. One time, she even leaned across the table and whispered, "Don't you wish you'd married someone with a real career? Someone who could take you to Paris instead of planting tomatoes?" I remember my chest tightening, my fingers digging into the edge of my chair, but I swallowed it down because my husband's hand was on my knee, gently grounding me. He always told me, people reveal more about themselves than they do about us. At the time, I admired his patience, but in truth, I was growing tired of being silent. The worst part was my parents. They didn't just laugh, they began parroting her views. They praised her husband constantly, going on about his incredible bonuses and his future in management. My father would pat him on the back and say, "You're really building something for the future." And then, in the same breath, he'd turn to my husband and ask, "So, how's the weather been on the farm?" As if his entire life's work could be reduced to a passing small talk question. And the digs kept growing bolder. My sister bragged about their vacations in Italy, their new car, their dinner parties with important people. Each time, she looked at me with a smirk, as if daring me to compare. She'd end her stories with some version of, "I guess you wouldn't understand." Farming doesn't exactly leave room for that kind of lifestyle, does it? I held my tongue, more times than I can count, but inside, the anger brewed hotter and hotter. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the man beside me, the man who worked harder in one day than her husband probably did in a week. The man who never complained, never showed off, never asked for more than what he earned. To see Him diminished so casually, so consistently, was like watching someone chip away at a statue I treasured. By this point, family gatherings stopped feeling like traditions. They felt like battlegrounds, carefully disguised under smiles and dinner napkins. Every insult piled on top of the last, and every laugh from my parents felt like a betrayal. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their laughter was building towards something they wouldn't be able to laugh off later. Every smirk, every slight, was a debt they were accruing. And life, I knew, had a way of demanding payment in full. It happened during the holidays. My parents had invited us all over for a big family dinner, complete with decorations, music, and more food than anyone could eat in one sitting. On the surface, it looked warm and inviting, but I'd learned to brace myself whenever we gathered like that. My sister always seemed to find her sharpest words during celebrations, as if my husband's quiet presence somehow threatened her shine. That evening, things started as usual. My parents fussed over her children, complimented her dress, and asked endless questions about her husband's work. They nodded approvingly as he boasted about office politics, deadlines, and how indispensable he was to his company. My husband, sitting beside me, didn't interrupt. He simply listened politely, occasionally offering a smile or nod, his calloused hands folded neatly on his lap. Then, as dessert was being served, the moment came. My sister, swirling her wine, tilted her head at me with that familiar smirk. "You know," she said, her voice sugar-coated but dripping with disdain, "it's such a shame you'll probably never get to travel properly. Real vacations, I mean. Farming doesn't exactly pay like real work does it?" She laughed softly, and my parents chuckled in agreement. "Well, that's true," my mother added, as if she were stating some obvious fact. My father shrugged. "It's an honest life, but not exactly one that opens doors, dear." Their words stung more than usual this time. Maybe it was because it was Christmas, a time when families are supposed to come together. Maybe it was because my husband had worked himself to the bone that year, expanding his contracts, hiring new workers, keeping everything running despite storms and setbacks. Maybe it was simply because I was tired of swallowing my anger, tired of pretending it didn't matter. But something inside me snapped. I looked at my sister, her smug little smile, her manicured hand resting on her wine glass. I looked at my parents, sitting there, proud of her but blind to the man who had stood by me, provided for me, and built a life of integrity. And in that moment, I felt the knot in my stomach harden into resolve. I didn't lash out, not then. I didn't raise my voice or fling my napkin across the table like in some dramatic movie scene. No, my decision was quieter, but far stronger. I decided I was done letting them make us small. I decided that the next time they tried to reduce my husband to nothing, they would face the truth head on. That was the moment I transitioned from enduring their cruelty to planning for justice. I didn't know how yet, but I knew it would come, because I had seen enough of life to know this. Arrogance has a way of unraveling, and when it does, it's always messier than the arrogant ever imagine. After that holiday dinner, I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. My husband was beside me, already drifting into the deep, steady sleep of a man who had worked from dawn to dusk. I envied that peace, but my mind refused to rest. Every laugh from my sister replayed. In my head, every nod of agreement from my parents echoed like a drumbeat. I could feel the sting in my chest all over again. But somewhere amid that anger, another feeling stirred clarity. Because here's the thing. My sister and my parents thought they had me cornered. They assumed we lived a life of quiet desperation, barely scraping by, wishing we had what they flaunted. But the truth was that we were far from desperate. My husband had been quietly building something far more secure than my sister could even imagine. Over the years, he had expanded his farm piece by piece, investing carefully, reinvesting profits instead of splurging on luxuries. He didn't just grow crops, he grew a business. Contracts with supermarkets, local restaurants, and even schools guaranteed that his produce was not only sold, but sold months in advance. While others were bragging about bonuses and promotions, my husband was creating stability that would last decades. I thought about the savings account we rarely touched, the retirement funds steadily growing, the fact that we had no debt, not a cent. Our cars were paid off. Our house was ours. Meanwhile, my sister and her husband were drowning in loans for their luxury cars, their oversized house, their endless vacations they couldn't really afford. And then it hit me, their arrogance wasn't just ugly, it was fragile. Every insult they threw at us was built on the shaky foundation of appearances. They had status, but no stability. We had the opposite. That realization became my weapon. I didn't need to argue with them. I didn't need to raise my voice or trade insults. All I had to do was wait. Wait for the day when the house of cards they had built would start to wobble. Because it would. I knew it. I had watched enough of their lifestyle to understand it couldn't last forever. And when that day came, when the cracks finally showed, I would be ready. Not with anger, but with the truth they had refused to see. The truth that the farmer they mocked had built a kingdom out of the very soil they scorned. Lying there in the dark, I whispered a silent promise to myself. They would learn, not because I demanded respect, but because life itself would force them to see what they had ignored, and I would make sure they never forgot it. It didn't take long for the cracks in my sister's perfect world to appear. Life has a way of catching up with people who spend more than they earn, who chase appearances while ignoring reality. It started with her husband's job. The company he worked for so proudly flaunted at every dinner announced a round of restructuring. At first, my sister tried to play it down. She said it was just a small hiccup, nothing to worry about. But within weeks, the truth came out. Her husband had been let go. Just like that, the indispensable man was suddenly without a paycheck. I found out about it in the most ironic way. My mother called me, her voice tight and worried. She never used to call me unless she wanted to compare me to my sister. But now she sounded different. "Your sister's husband is between jobs," she said carefully, as though the words tasted bitter. "It's a difficult time for them." Difficult time, indeed. The lavish lifestyle they had built on credit started collapsing almost immediately. The new car payments, the mortgage on the oversized house, the endless luxury expenses they came due whether a salary arrived or not. Within months, my sister was no longer posting glossy vacation photos online. Instead, she called me. At first, it was subtle. She hinted about how lucky we were to live so simply, without all the stress of a big mortgage. She asked casually if we were managing okay with the farm. I could hear the strain in her voice, the cracks in her confidence. I answered politely, never offering more than she asked for. Then, one evening, the mask dropped completely. My parents called, and this time they didn't mince words. "Your sister and her husband are in real trouble," my mother said, her voice urgent. "They need help, financial help. 20,000 should cover it, just to get them back on their feet." I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, almost stunned into silence. 20,000. They said it like it was a neighborly favor, like they were asking me to water their plants while they were away. I could almost hear my sister in the background, her voice sharp, urging them on. For a moment, I didn't respond. Instead, I let the irony sink in. The same people who had laughed at my husband, who had sneered at our simple life, who had dismissed him as just a farmer, were now turning to us in desperation. I thought about my husband then, how he never boasted, never asked for recognition, and yet had built a life where $20,000 wasn't even a threat to our stability. And I thought about my sister, her smirks, her mockery, her arrogance. It was time. I didn't refuse them outright, not then. Instead, I said calmly, "Why don't you all come over this weekend? Let's talk about it in person." Because if there was ever going to be a moment of justice, I wanted them to see it with their own eyes. I wanted them to step onto the land they had belittled and face the truth they had denied for so long. That weekend would change everything. The weekend came quickly, and I made sure everything was ready. Our home wasn't extravagant, but it was warm, spacious, and welcoming. Over the years, we had renovated bit by bit: new hardwood floors, a modern kitchen, wide windows that looked out onto the fields. It was a house built with care, not flash, and to me, that made it beautiful. My husband didn't change anything for their visit. He didn't polish himself up or pretend to be someone else. That was one of the things I loved most about him, his quiet refusal to perform for anyone's approval. Instead, he spent the morning as he always did, checking the irrigation lines, greeting the workers, and making sure the day's harvest was loaded for delivery. By the time my sister and parents pulled up in their sleek car, dust already coated its shiny tires. I met them at the door with a smile that felt calm, though inside my heart was beating fast. My sister stepped in first, her eyes darting around the entryway. I could see it immediately. She had expected cramped, outdated furniture, maybe peeling wallpaper, and a faint smell of livestock. Instead, she found a polished home filled with sunlight and warmth. "This is your house?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Yes," I said, smiling. "Ours." Her husband gave a low whistle. My parents were quiet, their eyes taking in the details. Already, I could see their certainty slipping. But it didn't end there. My husband appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "You came at a good time," he said easily. "Let me show you around." And with that, he led them outside. We walked the gravel path to the fields. Rows of crops stretching as far as the eye could see. Workers moved steadily, harvesting, loading crates onto trucks marked with the logos of major grocery chains. The hum of machinery filled the air, a tractor in the distance, the rumble of a delivery truck pulling away. "This is all yours?" my father asked slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief. My husband nodded. "Yes. Contracts keep us busy year-round. We supply several supermarket chains, schools, and a few restaurants in the city. It's a lot to manage, but we're grateful for the work." My sister's mouth opened, then closed again. She looked around, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to make sense of it all. For years, she had painted this picture of us scraping by, barely surviving. Now, faced with the reality of acres of thriving farmland and a small fleet of trucks ready for delivery, she was speechless. "But, you're just a farmer," she finally blurted out. My husband smiled, not unkindly. "Yes, just a farmer." Her words hung in the air, hollow now, stripped of the power they once held. I watched my parents then. My mother's face had gone pale, and my father shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. I could almost hear their thoughts racing, realizing how wrong they had been. How foolish their laughter seemed now. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. My sister, her pride crumbling, turned to me. We need help, she admitted, her voice trembling. We just need a loan. 20,000. That's all. You can spare it, right? Her words, once dripping with arrogance, now carried the weight of desperation. It was the first time I had ever seen her look small, and in that silence, I felt a calm settle over me. They finally understood. The air was still when she asked, her voice brittle, her eyes darting nervously between me and my husband. For the first time in my life, my sister wasn't smirking. She wasn't holding herself above me, looking down her nose with that mocking tilt of her chin. Instead, she looked like a woman cornered, stripped of the armor she had spent years parading in front of us. We just need the 20,000, she said again, softer this time, as though repeating it would make it easier to swallow. It's nothing to you, right? Her words carried the weight of all the insults she had ever hurled at us. Nothing to you. As though the man she mocked as just a farmer could never possibly have that kind of money. But here she was, begging for it. My husband didn't rush to answer. He simply looked at her, his face calm, steady. I could almost feel the years of patience in his silence, the way he had endured every slight, every laugh, every jab without complaint. Now, all he had to do was stand there. The truth was speaking for itself. Finally, he smiled faintly and said, "Funny how being just a farmer has put us in a position to help you." The irony landed like a stone in water. I saw it ripple through them, my sister palling, her husband shifting uncomfortably, my parents lowering their eyes. It was as if the ground had tilted beneath their feet, and they were scrambling to find balance. I stepped forward then, my voice steady but firm. "Respect works both ways," I said. "You spent years mocking us, treating us like we were beneath you. And now you're here, asking for our help. Do you see the problem with that?" No one spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating. My sister's lips trembled, as though she wanted to protest. But what could she say? The truth was undeniable. "We built this life with hard work and humility," I continued. "Not by pretending to be something we're not. Not by mocking others. If you had treated us with kindness, maybe this would be different. But you didn't. And I won't reward cruelty with generosity." My husband said nothing more. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. A living reminder of everything they had underestimated. My sister's face crumpled, and for the first time, I didn't feel pity. I felt justice, because in that moment, the balance was restored. The very thing they had mocked had become the thing they needed most. And instead of finding a savior, they found the consequence of their own arrogance staring back at them. After that day, something in the dynamic of my family shifted forever. My sister and her husband left our home quietly, without another word. There was no final jab, no sarcastic remark to cover their shame. They simply gathered their things, avoided eye contact, and walked out into the fading light. Watching their car disappear down the gravel road, I felt an immense stillness settle inside me. Not joy exactly, justice. The weeks that followed told the rest of the story. My sister's life unraveled faster than even I had imagined. Without her husband's job and with mounting debt from their oversized house, they had no safety net. They were forced to sell the luxury cars first, then the house itself. Soon they were renting a small apartment on the edge of town far from the glittering life she used to parade around. My parents, who once boasted about her success at every opportunity, suddenly grew quiet. For the first time, I noticed hesitation in their voices when they spoke to me. They no longer dismissed my husband or waved off his work as just farming. They had seen too much with their own eyes. Their arrogance had been replaced with something unfamiliar to me: caution. They didn't apologize, not in so many words. My parents weren't the type to admit fault outright, but their behavior changed. They no longer made sly comments. They stopped comparing me to my sister altogether. And though they tread carefully, I could feel it. The respect they had withheld for so long was finally there, even if it came too late. As for my sister, she avoided me for a long time. Months went by without a word, and when I did eventually see her at a holiday gathering, the sparkle was gone from her eyes. She looked older somehow, weighed down not just by her circumstances, but by the realization that she had spent years mocking the very people who had built a life far sturdier than her own. She kept her distance, polite but subdued, and I didn't push for anything more, because by then, I no longer needed her validation. My husband and I continued living the life we had always chosen: quiet, steady, and fulfilling. The farm expanded even further, and with it came opportunities to travel, not because we needed to prove anything, but simply because we wanted to. I remember standing on a beach in Greece one evening, holding his hand, thinking of the time my sister had laughed that we would never see the world. And yet, there we were, not chasing appearances, but living them on our own terms. That was the greatest victory of all, not the fact that we thrived while my sister stumbled, but the truth that we never needed to prove ourselves to begin with. We had built something real, and no amount of scorn could erase that. If there is a moral to this story, it is this: arrogance always comes at a cost. My sister thought wealth was measured in shiny things and bragging rights, but true wealth is built in silence, in patience, in work that speaks for itself. Respect cannot be demanded with money, it has to be earned through humility. And as for my husband, the man they once dismissed as just a farmer, he remains the greatest source of pride in my life. Not because of the success he's built, but because of the man he's always been: steady, kind, and unshaken by the shallow judgments of others. Justice, in the end, didn't come through revenge or cruelty. It came naturally, as it always does, when the truth finally reveals itself. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.